we're supposed to protect, we're supposed to provide, we're supposed to provide an element of security for society so that society can actually thrive. I think genuine masculinity provides a environment where genuine femininity can thrive. And what all of that means is that if you look at kind of the 5 categories that I always break out, you've got the spiritual, the intellectual, the emotional, the physical, and the professional. So I see my job is I'm supposed to honor God with respect to the way I live my life.
Nick, what's up, brother? So great to see you. Thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
No, it's an honor. Thanks for having me on.
I've been a longtime follower. I mentioned to you before we hit the record button, I think what I like most about what you do is you weave the conversations about manliness and masculinity into a bit of a political narrative, but also I think more importantly than that, a cultural narrative. And I think the two are closely aligned, but a lot of men don't seem to be able to differentiate between political and cultural, and they're just not willing to get involved the way it seems like you are.
Well, our politics has become so intertwined. There's a saying that politics is downstream from culture, and that's true, but politics can also impact and affect culture as well, especially the larger and more intrusive government gets. And so, yeah, we definitely try to talk about things from a cultural standpoint because, honestly, I don't want people obsessed with politics. You got to pay attention to it. You got to be involved on some level. But ultimately, if you want your country to thrive, start with your family, right? Start with the people around you that you can kind of, have the greatest impact with. And so a lot of what we discuss is the cultural component, but also kind of explaining how politics is, I would argue, increasingly standing in the way of families thriving, and specifically the role, I would say, of men in society and fathers and husbands.
What do you feel like the role of men in society is? I think traditionally and historically, we've always had a pretty good understanding as a society of what that means. It really isn't until the relative ease of modernity where that has even been called into question. So what is your take on our role in society and culture?
I think, well, look, I always tell people this, I'm first and foremost a Christian. And so my biblical worldview informs what I believe it is to be a man. And so we are someone that is supposed to, when you look at our role in the physical world, we're supposed to protect, we're supposed to provide, we're supposed to provide an element of security for society so that society can actually thrive. I think genuine masculinity provides a environment where genuine femininity can thrive. And what all of that means is that if you look at kind of the 5 categories that I always break out, you've got the spiritual, the intellectual, the emotional, the physical, and the professional. So I see my job is I'm supposed to honor God with respect to the way I live my life. Intellectually, I'm supposed to be formidable and capable. I'm supposed to develop my ability to be able to think about things in a way that is, uses critical thought and analysis in order to come to logical conclusions. When it comes to the emotional, I'm supposed to regulate my emotions in such a way to where that I can fulfill my duties, but that I can also show tenderness and compassion to the people that need it from me. When it comes to the physical, I'm supposed to keep myself in a certain degree of shape so that, once again, I can fulfill the proper duties that I need to. And when it comes to the professional, that kind of falls into not only the provision side of providing for a family or providing for myself or people in need, but also I believe that we were designed to create, and challenges shape us. And a lot of times when men don't have a healthy challenge that they can pursue, they look for destructive ones. And so that professional component is about developing the sort of capabilities that are necessary in order to be able to provide, but also to be able to share in creation.
Yeah. I mean, that's a powerful framework. I work really well under frameworks, and having that system in front of me almost in a way helps me see on a daily basis, am I hitting each of those 5? I use 4, but the overlap is very similar. Is this something that you've always identified? Is this something that you've had to develop? Like, what does your upbringing look like, and the view of healthy masculinity with regards to how your father showed up or lack thereof, and where did this framework derive from?
Sure. So I was not planned, right? At least not by my parents. My mom was actually, she was going to a Bible college in Southern California. She's going to Biola for her nursing degree. And she knew my dad they had both grown up in Northern California, and knew my dad from there. And they were dating at the time. And then she ended up pregnant with me at a Bible college, in the 70s.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So she had to drop out of school. Her and my dad got married. My dad was a police officer. He was LAPD. My mom was a nurse. They had my brother, and then they got divorced shortly after that. So I was a little over 3, I think it was 3.5, 4 when they got divorced. And then my dad lived in Southern California. My mom lived in Northern California. And for the rest of my life growing up, I would spend the school year with my mom and the summers with my dad. And one of the things that was really formative to me growing up was that both sets of grandparents lived in Northern California. So during the school year, I'd go to school. My mom worked very, very hard as a nurse. And she, I got to spend a lot of time with my grandparents, who I just absolutely loved and adored. I also just completely admired my father. He's LAPD. He was the sort of guy that I thought was a good picture of masculinity. My dad got remarried. My mom got remarried. My mom and my stepdad got divorced. My dad and my stepmom ended up also getting divorced later, but after they had 7 more kids, so I'm the oldest of 9.
Whoa.
So it was it was a weird dynamic. But I can honestly say, I was blessed to have 2 parents that, even though their marriage didn't work out, they didn't try to use us against each other. They always respected that. I always felt that, at least in front of us, they had their own problems, but at least in front of us, my mom was always very respectful of my father respectful of my mother. I have a great deal of admiration for my mom, just absolute go-getter. But also someone that showed a great deal of compassion and empathy. So it was interesting, because I don't think anybody would look at that and say, oh yeah, that's the ideal picture of, mom and dad in the house raising the kids. But that stuff happens. And I was always very, very grateful.
Actually.
Yeah. And I was always very, very grateful of the fact that there was 3 things that I thought my parents did under less than ideal circumstances that was very formative to me. One, they never made it out that, well, this is normal. They both appreciated that the goal was to get married and stay married, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And instead of treating that like, well, it's no big deal, they treated it, no, it is a big deal. And the ideal is not this, but we're still going to do our best to be a mother and a father. Really appreciate that. The second thing I already said before is they never used the kids against one another to try to score points or anything like that. And then the third part is that there was a certain element of their worldview within their Christian faith that they shared, that they could build a consistent moral framework around, even if they weren't always able to live it out or represent it the way they would want to. They never blamed the framework, right? They said, yeah, we screwed up, and now we've got to make the best of what happened. But it's not that the framework is wrong. It's not that the morality is wrong. It's just that sometimes, sometimes it doesn't happen that way. So what do you move on from there? And what that also taught me was a certain degree of resiliency, that you don't get to sit there and wallow in something when things don't go the way that you want them to, that you might have planned them toward, but you still got to persevere. You still got things to do, things to accomplish. And so I was very, I was very grateful for that. I thought both of them worked very, very hard to be able to model that.
I commend you for extracting those lessons, but also your parents for being in that situation, because I know it's difficult. Personally, I've gone through a divorce about a little over a year ago now, and I strive for those things. But even still, when you have this interpersonal communication and stories and baggage that you're framing all your lessons through and your stories through, it's hard to extract the wisdom of being cordial with each other, recognizing reality, that this is an ideal, but also not pitting the kids against each other. And so I strive for that. So I can really appreciate how hard that must have been for your parents, and then for you to be able to extract those lessons.
Yeah, well, and I think one of the things that it's important for, I think it's important for kids growing up in those environments to have a little bit of, especially as you start to get older, when you know that your parents loved you, when you know that they were really trying, they're really trying, right? And sometimes it doesn't work the way that anybody would like. A growth thing for a child, especially as they start to become an adult, is cut your parents some slack. They were, a number of things can happen to throw things off kilter, and you are going to get so much more out of your relationship with your parents, and it's going to allow you to learn the lessons that you need to, if you can cut your parents some slack and appreciate the effort that they put in to a messy situation. And I actually see kids nowadays to where when their parents don't provide them, everything that they thought they should or the ideal environment, it's like, okay, but can you also look at what maybe your parents had to endure before, before you came along? What did they have to overcome? And instead of sitting there and playing the victim because you didn't get everything that you wanted, can you appreciate that, hey, they did their best by you, and now you're going to build and you're going to learn from that. And, it's interesting. My wife came from a situation where her parents both got divorced as well. And we got married at 19 and 20. Now, she grew up in a divorced home. I grew up in multiple divorced homes. Anybody will tell you getting married at 19 and 20 was a horrible decision for us, right? But we just celebrated 25 years of marriage. And that was 25
Congrats.
years of marriage. And I joined the military. So 19 and 20, I go off to the military. And, we've been married. We get married about a little less than a year after I'm in the military. I'm at the 82nd Airborne Division. And then we reenlist. We go to Hawaii. We have our first daughter. 9/11 happens. I volunteer for Army Special Forces. And then, I'm going to Iraq. I'm going to Asia. I'm going to all these other places doing this. And so I always tell people the first 10 years of marriage, I spent half of it away. And she had and we had 3 kids while I was in the military. And so again, anybody will tell you that's not ideal. That's not an ideal situation for a marriage. But one of the things I chalk up to is that both her and I experienced things growing up that we didn't want to replicate. And what it did is that it provided an invitation for both of us to ask some really hard questions while we were still very, very young and dating and determine whether or not we wanted to build a life together. And that was very helpful for us, moving forward. But I always tell people that either grew up in divorced homes or are going through a divorce or whatnot, there's still such a huge formative role that you can play to be able to help your kids navigate that. And the role of the parents is to persevere through it. And the role of the kids is to cut their parents some slack.
Was there any red flags with your wife as you were doing the military thing? And I was in the military too. I did a combat tour in 2005 and 6 in Ramadi, Iraq. And I was newly married at the time, so I can relate a little bit with what you're going through. Were there any red flags that you experienced with her? And then also, how did you know that she was committed? Because I'm sure you took on a lot of baggage as a kid with your mom and dad, and then your dad going through another divorce. And so I'm sure there was some baggage that you took on that, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I imagine, hey, is love real? Does marriage last? Et cetera, et cetera.
So when Tina, so let me put it this way, like in high school, I went to a very, very small school. We had a graduating class of like 27, right? To give you an idea of how small it was. My wife was way too.
I had 41 and I thought I was small. So 27 is almost half that, right?
Yeah. My wife was way too hot for me. We met our freshman year. She dated a different guy. I was, hung up on a different girl for a lot of high school and whatnot. And I was the guy that, the best way I could describe it is I was really searching for, I wanted to be an honorable man. And, that probably sounds a little bit weird. The best way I got, again, growing up around my grandfather and seeing my dads during the summer, like my grandfather was, joined the Navy in World War II when he was 16, threatened to run away from home if his dad wouldn't let him sign up and join. And then he was he was a logger, and then he was a firefighter. My dad was, again, a homicide detective. My other grandpa had served in the Air Force and had always done jobs that he was a surveyor in Alaska for the pipeline. So I grew up around these men that I looked at as being models of strength.
Very manly men, it sounds
yes. Like. Yeah. Very, very manly men. But also accessible, right? You could sit down. They would tell you their stories. My grandfather was an incredibly likable man. Like, everybody loved Bill Freitas, right? So there was that aspect, and then I got really into like Civil War history when I was like 11 or 12. And I remember watching the Ken Burns documentary, and one of the things that's just flush with is this idea, and John Lovell, who you know, would call this the warrior poet, right? It was the idea of these men that had a mission and a focus, and were engaging in a form of combat that was just incredible because the technology had surpassed the tactics. And so you're marching in Napoleonic formation, and the officers are out in front leading their men. And I'm growing up surrounded by these strong men, wanting to be like them, delving into a historical period which was really kind of enamored with courage and bravery and purpose and chivalry, and the way you properly treat a woman, and the way you properly, protect a woman. And there was, it was just, so I was kind of immersed in that, and I wanted to be that. Well, I got news for you. If you're a young man growing up and you want to be all of those things, and you're sitting there reading Civil War history while all of your peers are not, you're going to be a little bit awkward, right?
You're the weirdo. You're
a little
weirdo.
bit. And I wasn't so socially awkward that I wasn't, like, I had friends, and I played sports and the whole deal, and I got along with people just fine. But I had this idea that, like, I'm the teenage boy that's constantly opening the doors for, the girls as they walk in the classroom. And I'm very sincere. Like, if I want to date a girl, I'm very sincere about my intentions and boundaries and the whole deal. And I'm watching buddies of mine that are just kind of, let's just say that is not their approach. And the girls are all attracted to them, not me, right? Like, I'm friend zoned. I'm totally
You're the
friend
good
zoned.
guy. They're the bad guy. They want to spend time with the bad guy. Sure, I get it.
I am the guy they call up to complain about my buddy that they're dating, right? And I remember thinking, screw this. Like, by my senior year, I'm thinking, no, this is bullcrap. Like, I was honorable. I was polite. I was all these other things, and it did not pay off. And then there was this point where Tina, all of a sudden, we kind of recognized that we were interested in one another. And I'm thinking, like, this can't be, like, this has got to be a dare for her, right? Like, she can't be truly interested in me. And I remember, I'm like, I'm going to play it cool. I'm going to play it cool. I promise you this is all going somewhere. And I remember as we started dating, it's our senior year, and I'm like, well, I'm going off to the Army. So, hey, cool, maybe we can date our senior year and the whole deal, but I don't expect this to last. And the longer we're dating, the more I'm just like, man, I really care about this girl, right? Like, I really love this girl, but I'm not saying crap. I'm not going to be sincere. I'm not going to be open with my feelings, because you get hurt for doing that. And I remember the day I left for basic training, she shows up and she's there to see me off. And I'm like, well, this is what happens, right? I'm going to go to basic, and there's no way this hot girl that a ton of dudes want to date is going to stick with me while I'm in basic training. You're going to get a
Dear John letter before too long here.
I'm going to get a Dear John rant. Jody's going to be in force, and that's what's going to happen. And so I tell her the day I'm leaving, I'm like, well, look, I'm obviously not going to be dating anybody else in infantry basic training, right? But if you want to, you're free to. Yeah, right? But if you want to, you're free to. You're free to. And she was mad. She'll tell you to this day, she was mad that that's what I told her. But that was a defense mechanism, right? Because, like you said, how did I know she was going to stick with me? How did I know that she was going to be, that she was committed to this? So I wanted to give her every opportunity, all permission to go off and do what she wanted. She wrote me a letter every single day I was in infantry basic training. Every single day. And you know the deal when you first get into basic or whatnot, it's not like all your letters show up regularly, right? It's like, so like 2 weeks, 3 weeks into, yeah, 3 weeks, I'm still waiting. Like, I said, oh, see, I was right. I got to make like one call to her in the first month I was down there. I'm like, see, this is it, man. Like, the letters aren't coming. And all right, this is what it was. And I was a little bit heartbroken there for a moment. And then all of a sudden I get 3 weeks of letters in one day. And every day, every time we got mail after that, I always had something. I always had a letter. And she showed up to infantry basic training, and I had to go to airborne school right after that. And we were right there on the Chattahoochee at this restaurant. And that was the day I told her that I loved her.
How long was that you guys had been together at that point?
We had been together at that point probably 8 months.
Okay.
No, it was longer than that. Gosh, it was almost 10 months. It was almost a year.
Really? Before you said I love you. Interesting.
Oh, I wasn't doing it,
obviously
man.
you were gone. Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't doing it. I wasn't going to say and then when I was in basic, I wasn't going to say I love you in a letter, right? I was going to say it in person to her. And she had told me, she'll later tell me, she was like, I knew I loved you. She goes, but I was going to make you say it first.
Did you say it first?
But what's that?
Did you say it first?
I said it first,
Awesome.
and then she said, "Are you sure?" I said yes, and she goes, "I love you too."
As a man should, I think. A man should always say it first.
I think. Look, I think we need to recognize that when it comes to relationships, women are already going into that from a higher degree of vulnerability than we are, and so showing vulnerability to her, I think, is perfectly appropriate if you're serious about it. Right? It should never be a manipulative thing. And both of us had grown up in environments where we had seen that break down, and so we wanted it to be genuine. And but we had also talked. We had talked in depth about marriage without either one of us saying "I love you" to the other one, because we also wanted to know that that's what we wanted, and that's what we were serious about. But yeah, so that is how I knew that she was going to be. That's how I thought. Like, okay, that was a good test of loyalty, right? Basic training. And then when we were in the military, I never had to worry. She never gave me cause to worry. That's one thing too. We talk a lot about the responsibilities that men have to their wives, and I think that's absolutely true. Wives also have responsibilities to their husband. And if your husband's going to be away a lot, making sure that you're conducting yourself in such a way to where you know that he's it for you is really important. And she always did that. Same thing with my combat tours. I was actually over in Iraq in 2006 as well. I was up in Beji in 2006. So we were over in Iraq at the same time. And same thing. She wrote regularly. She'd always send pictures. Like we had children at the time. She would, make stuff for the kids to wear and make sure that they stayed connected with daddy. When I came home from my first combat tour, there wasn't a lot of, there's always that when you come back home and it's reintegrating into the family. She made that so seamless for me because when I was gone, she never complained about me being gone. And it has to be hard, right? It has to be hard.
Unbelievably hard. Harder on women than it is for the guys overseas, I think.
I mean, they're dealing with so much uncertainty and so much things that they can't control, and they don't get a rifle to shoot off the things that are plaguing them, right? But she always reinforced to my kids and I went back in 2008. She always reinforced to my kids like, hey, daddy would love to be here with us, but daddy's protecting us, daddy's serving his country, and we are so proud of him. So when I came home, my kids were thrilled to see me. They didn't feel abandoned. They didn't feel disconnected from daddy, right? It was, they loved daddy and they were so happy he was home. And that wasn't me, that was her. And so time after time, she had just demonstrated that when she was committed to when she was also committed to our marriage. And so she embraced the roles that she had to play within that marriage and just consistently reinforced that she was there through thick and thin. And that doesn't mean that every time it was happy too. Like I remember us being on a phone call. I got back from a combat tour, went straight to a J set. I'm on a satellite phone in Bangladesh. I just got an opportunity to go to a Sephardic, which was kind of a high-speed CQB school. And I'm saying, hey baby, when I get back home from Bangladesh, 2 weeks later, I gotta leave and she was not happy. She's like, this ain't war, babe. Yeah. You could be home. This ain't war, right? And but one of the other things that my wife always did for me that was really incredible is and this is rooted in our faith. Our thing is that I am the head of the household. Now, a lot of men get caught up on being in charge without understanding the responsibility that comes with that, because what that honestly means within a biblical worldview is my life for hers. And there's only been one time. There's only been probably 2 or 3 times in the whole course of our marriage where we could not reach resolution on a course of action. And we prayed about it, we debated about it, we talked about it. Sometimes we had heated discussions about it, the whole deal, right? We're both passionate people. And we finally came to a point where it's like the decision has to be made. And she goes, well, babe, I will follow your lead. And when she said that, she didn't just mean, okay, I will begrudgingly do what you say because you're the head of the household and you have that responsibility. It was, I will now commit myself to this decision to make it work.
So she went all in rather than just complied. It was hey, commitment versus compliance.
Yes, it was. I don't agree that this is the hill we should be charging, but we got to charge it. We got to move. So now I'm going to move, and now I'm going to charge it. And again, it's one of those things that have just reinforced over time. Whenever I'm in difficult situations, like, no, I know she's got my back, and she knows I have hers. She has to also know that if I have to make a decision, that I have to make so with her well-being and the well-being of our children and our marriage above my own needs, wants, and desires. And sometimes that can be difficult too, because it's really easy to make your own needs, wants, and desires what's best for the marriage or best for the family. And and she has to trust that I'm not doing that.
So I'm taking notes like fervishly. I don't know if you can hear me punching away on my keyboard. I'm taking notes here, but I have a couple of questions on that. So first question is why, well, let me ask this as the first question. Do you remember what those scenarios were? Number one, like what is it that you guys couldn't come to resolution on that she finally acquiesced to your desire, your path? And then second to that is, what is it about you that she decided to do it? Like, why would she, for lack of a better term, be subservient to your desire or your path?
Yeah, to submit. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it was a big one. I was leaving the military, and our plan had been, hey, we're going to leave the military. We're going to go back. We're going to go back home. So I got out at 11 years. So it's not like I got a pension or anything like that. I got to immediately find work. Well, I found work working out of Palo Alto for a company that I was doing consulting with on their analytical software and things of that nature. It's like, okay, this is kind of ideal, right? We're moving back on that plan where we're going to go back home. And her dad was sick at the time. And so she was very much looking forward to getting back close to family, helping out with her father. And I called an audible on all that. There was a contract opening up in Virginia. Now, I'd always wanted to live in Virginia. But the other thing that was becoming apparent was that I wasn't going to be able to do the job I was doing in California. I could do it in Virginia. Arguably, I could have done it some other places, but I was not going to be able to do it close to family. But, very convenient, right? Like, oh, you want to live in Virginia, and now the only job opportunity you can find is in Virginia, right? Oh, okay.
Isn't that convenient, right?
Yeah, yeah. And we had to discuss through that and talk through that. And there was things that I assumed inappropriately where I didn't properly communicate to her or explain what was going on. In part because she had done such a good job of going with the flow. But the difference was that was when the military was directing the flow, right? Now it's like, no, babe, we can actually make some of these decisions, and you can't, don't act unilaterally. Let me in on the decision. And that was some growth I had to do on my part as well. But she was convinced that I wouldn't have just arbitrarily done this because I wanted to. I made a good argument for why. Here's the other thing too. Her letting me make the decision didn't mean there weren't weeks of going back and forth and discussing things. And another thing that I really appreciate about my wife is that I will hear guys sometimes talk about this idea that, well, don't argue with your wife, just happy wife, happy life, and go on from there. That's garbage. If I think my wife's wrong, I tell her, and we have a discussion about it. And the agreement that she struck from me is, talk to me like I'm the woman that you love. Right? We can have discussions, we can have debates, but never talk to me like you're trying to beat me in a debate. Talk to me like I'm the woman that you love.
Or like one of your soldiers, right? I know that was a problem for me and a lot of guys. It's like, are you talking to me or one of your guys? That's something I've often heard.
Oh, and it's true, because it's hard, right? When you're used to commanding, that's very, very different than what the relationship is like in the marriage. So I remember very early on, first year of marriage, she's like, baby, you need to talk to me like I'm the woman you love. I'm like, okay, that stuck with me. That stuck with me. The thing that I always told her too is, it's like, look, emotions matter, but facts are facts. And regardless of how we feel about them, they're facts. And she respected that. So there are times where she would be willing to come forward and say, look, babe, I know you're right, but I'm just mad. I'm just mad that you're right? I'm mad that this is the reality. Sure. And that was fine. I could deal with that, right? Like, let me know. And I can deal with the fact that, yeah, you're right. This sucks. And so some of like hammering out that method that we would communicate that, look, facts matter and they're not going to trump, again, emotions don't trump reality, but I still need to make sure that I'm being respectful of, sometimes we got to make hard decisions. And so that was a key component. That was a key component of being able to make those hard decisions when those times came, but also me understanding that my job was not to try to, browbeat her into submission. My job was to try for us to convince each other of the best possible course of action for our marriage and for our family. And to the extent that we can do, and we've done that before where she's won the argument. I'll never forget one time. I can't even remember exactly what we were arguing about, but we've been arguing for 3 days about something. And we're in the car and she presents this argument and I'm like, yeah, okay. Yeah, you're right. I'm wrong. We'll do it that way. And she goes, are you freaking kidding me? 3 days of arguing about this? And I said, well, babe, respectfully, all of your other arguments sucked. Like, I had an answer for all the other ones, but this one I don't. And if I don't have an answer for it, then my job is to not be prideful. My job is to acknowledge you got the best argument. That is the best course of action. And so that's the one we're going to take. And I think that was also demonstrative of for her that, she would hopefully the sort of environment that I created for my wife and that I know she created for me was, I will have to argue against your argument, but I won't have to argue against your pride, right? The pride won't make the decision in the end. The best argument based off of what is best for our family will win in the end.
I like that. I want to go back to something that you had talked about with this concept of the good guy versus the bad guy and how women tend to chase the bad guy. This conversation has taken a little deviation from what I expected it to be, but I want to continue to go down this rabbit hole.
Yeah.
I think there's probably some women who listen to our podcast. About 20% of listeners are women and the 80% are men. And I think it'd be valuable if we could share a message or if you have a thought as to what you could talk about with the good guy versus the bad guy and who women are pursuing or interested in. I'd love to hear your take on that.
Well, I think I think there's a lot of things to unpack with that. One of the most interesting books you can read on something like this that was never intended to be a book on it is a book by Theodore Dalrymple, which is his pen name. His actual name is, I think, Dr. Anthony Daniels. And he taught, I'm trying to remember the title now. He wrote a book about all of his time basically working in, I'll look up the title so we got it for sure. But he wrote a book.
I'm going to look while you're doing that.
Yeah, Theodore Dalrymple, Life at the Bottom. That's what it's called. Life at the Bottom, and it was the mentality that creates the permanent underclass or whatnot. But one of the things he talked about in there was a lot of the women that he counseled as a psychologist were women that had been in incredibly dangerous and abusive relationships. And he asked this one woman, he goes, if your boyfriend were to walk in right now, how long would it take me to know that he was a bad guy? And she goes, you'd know instantly. And he goes, okay, well, presumably if I would know instantly he's a bad guy, then you knew he was a bad guy. And what he started to talk about was that sometimes in an environment where a woman has undergone abuse, she seeks it again because it's familiar. Another time, it's because sometimes it's drama. Sometimes it's the quest for drama. If you have a situation where all of the responsibilities that a person has have been removed from them and taken over by the state or the government or whatever else it is, they will seek out drama somewhere else. And a lot of times that's found in relationships. So one of the things I think is we should be very, very careful about when we talk about girls just chasing after the bad guy is that sometimes there's a lot of pent up abuse and damage that has taken place that has led a woman to that position. Other times, I think it is a lot of times who we call the bad guys are guys that are display a certain level of competence and capability. They may display a certain degree of physical prowess, and they display confidence, verbal acumen. Well, okay, well, think about all of those things are positive attributes. They're just being used to a bad purpose. So, because all of us as men want to be physically imposing. We want to be intellectually and emotionally capable, right? We want to be articulate, and we want to be confident. And again, a lot of times those things manifest themselves through adversity. So again, sometimes the bad boy is also, maybe they've gone through various adversities or whatnot and developed certain traits. So I think it's important to understand that if a woman is looking for someone that's confident, capable, and that can protect her, and that will make her feel, both excited and safe at the same time, well, then guys that are demonstrating those attributes are going to get women, whether they're good or bad. Now, a lot of times what ends up happening is as men and women mature, women also understand that, okay, I'm attracted to the attributes, but they have to be used and they have to manifest themselves in a positive way. And so, again, there's women also have just like men have a desire for a certain degree of excitement, so do women. And so if you again, I think we should learn something from the bad boys, but we should develop those capabilities and attributes in such a way as to use them for a noble purpose, but understand that, hey, look, she still wants to be swept off her feet. She still wants to feel protected. She still wants to feel an element of excitement. So how do we manifest those things in positive ways as opposed to negative ways?
This is so good. Like I said, you probably hear me punching away on my keyboard. I don't know if you've read it, but there's a good book called Manhood of the Making by David Gilmour. Does that ring a bell?
I don't know that one.
You should check that out. It's very academic. It almost reads like like some sort of college type literature that you would read as you're going through a program. But he talks about the difference between being a good man and being good at being a man. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the differentiation that you're making right now, is that we can take what the quote unquote bad boy has, capability, competence, physical prowess, like you said, but apply those towards virtuous outcomes as opposed to taking advantage of the opposite sex or anybody else for that matter. Yeah.
Oh no, absolutely. The differentiation I've heard made sometimes that I like is a good man versus a nice man. Like my job is not to be a nice man. That doesn't mean there's not times where I develop or that I display attributes or characteristics that would be considered nice, but my job is to be a good man, but that means a capable man. That also means a dangerous man. I was doing an interview with Lila Rose a while back, and we were talking about raising kids and how I was with my daughters versus how I was with my son. And one of the things I told Lila is I said, well, a good man has to be capable of violence. And that's one of the things I have to instill into my son. And she understood that, but she wanted me to elaborate a little bit more. And I said, well, look, I said, there is a side of me that has been seen by a relatively small group of people in Iraq, right? And that side of me will never come out toward my wife or my children, because that side of me is for them, never toward them. Right. But it also has to exist, because ultimately it's what helps them feel safe around me, that I have this capability which will only be used in service toward them, never as a threat toward them. But the other side of that is, okay, then how do I turn that off to also be able to show them the tenderness and the compassion and the love, and even sometimes, and I emphasize the silliness sometimes, right, with your kids. How do I turn that off in order to be able to do that? And that's the emotional maturity that has to develop. It's like, I'm not going to be, a lot of times, I think sometimes society, speaking on behalf of women, will try to articulate something for men that doesn't make any sense to us. Like, well, I want a man in touch with his feminine side. And then a man will translate that into, okay, then I'm going to display what I perceive to be feminine qualities, and you're going to like that, right? The answer is no, they don't like it. All of a sudden, you make them, you come off as weak. You make them feel unsecured or unsafe, or you're so emotionally available that you don't got your crap together, and you're supposed to be the calm in the storm, right? How are you the calm in the storm if you're breaking down crying alongside everybody else? It's like, so no, our job is not to be the blubbering male that's, so in touch with his feelings that he can't keep it together. We are supposed to be emotionally mature enough to where when it is appropriate and only to people who are worthy of it do they get to see that tenderness and that vulnerability. But that's not something I show to everybody, right? That's reserved for them because they're worthy and because they're special to me. They get to see that side of me that nobody else gets to see. But they still get to also see it with a controlled environment that never makes them feel unsafe. Right. And so I said, Lila, one of the things people need to understand about men is that's a difficult thing to develop. Right. That's a difficult thing to develop. And so, be patient with your man as they're developing it, they're doing it, and encourage it in the appropriate ways. But understand that we have to navigate this difficult spectrum where on one side, we're the sort of guy that can literally drag someone out of the house and like drag a threat out of the house and beat him in defense of our family. And at the same time, wear the little tiara and have tea with our little girl, right? Like we got to navigate both of those. And sometimes we don't always get it right. But when we're trying and when we're properly encouraged by the women in our lives to do it, that emotional maturity develops in the way it's supposed to.
Yeah, I had a good conversation with a friend of mine, Connor Beaton. He's with Man Talks, and he wrote a book called Men's Work, and we were talking about this concept of vulnerability. This is something we often hear as men. And one thing that he had said that really stuck out to me is that a lot of the times, to your point, women will ask for a man who's, you said, in touch with his feminine side. A lot of women will ask for a man who's vulnerable.
Yeah.
And sometimes we translate that as the blubbering idiot who cries and puts his head on his wife's shoulder, et cetera, et cetera. And then when a guy does that, of course, his wife is turned off by that, of course, obviously. But what he had said is that vulnerability to women isn't what we translate it to be. What they want us to know or want to acknowledge is that we recognize our deficiencies and we have a plan for dealing with it. So we recognize maybe it's insecurities, maybe it's past trauma or baggage, not to offload it onto our spouse, but to take it upon our own shoulders and then come up with an appropriate plan for dealing with it. That is what vulnerability means to women. It was a really interesting concept to me and something that I hadn't really heard the differentiating factor between.
No, I think that makes sense. I also think that I can say, let me give an example of this. So I'm about to walk my daughter down the aisle, right? In about a month.
Congrats.
And I just, thank you. And a great guy. We're very happy for both of them. And we'll go through this process where, there's been a lot of moments where it's like, I've gotten a little choked up, right? I've kept my crap together, but I've gotten a little choked up.
That'll happen at daddy-daughter dance though, I'm sure.
Oh yeah. That's yeah. But that's the part that, so if my wife were to explain, like, what do I mean when I want to see that, she would say, I want to see that tenderness. I want to, and part of that is because she's like, I know the soldier, I know the husband, I know the man, like I know the father, like I know all of that. That tenderness that only she gets, and that different tenderness that only my children get, or only my daughters get. Seeing that shows the heart behind it, and that's the sort of softness or tenderness. I don't even like to refer to it as vulnerability. It's because it's again, I would snap out of it in a heartbeat to protect them, and they know that. But when they get to see that element of tenderness that is uniquely for them, it's another way of showing them that, hey, nobody can crack daddy's armor except his little girl, right? And that's important.
Yeah, powerful stuff. What do you say about, and this is going back to something you said a bit ago, you had talked about this idea, just briefly, you mentioned it casually and in passing, you said the roles that we play.
Yeah.
And I think in culture and society today, that concept of traditional gender roles is something that's looked at as wrong thinking, as patriarchal, et cetera, et cetera. What is your thought as to the roles that men and women play in society?
Yeah. I think society's wrong.
I agree.
I've become far more adamant about openly expressing that, is that, yeah, the modern culture is wrong. And I don't care what studies you throw at me. And it's not because I can't be convinced through scientific research of a particular topic. It's because I think that this is so written into us and so demonstrable throughout human history and our own interactions that anytime someone is asking us to completely just abandon this concept, they just want us to suspend all disbelief and suggest that, well, an expert at a sociology department at Cal Berkeley did a study. I don't care.
Experts say, right? We know we're going to be fed a line for sure.
Now, what I will say is this. I do think that there's a strict version of this and a little bit more open version. So I always put it this way. No one is ever going to convince me that a man's responsibility for his family is not to protect and provide, right? That is two of the fundamental responsibilities of your role as a husband. I think you have a responsibility to lead. I think you have a responsibility to also be present for your children on an emotional level, not just a provisional level, right? So we can extrapolate from that again, men have to be, once again, if from the spiritual side, it provides a philosophical and moral underpinning for everything that you do. You emotionally means you have to be available. Physically means you have to be capable of doing stuff. Professionally means you got to be able to provide, right? And intellectual means you got to be able to effectively communicate. So there's all those categories are covered within those responsibilities. And I don't think that ever goes, nothing's going to convince me that isn't real. Does that mean that the only role for a woman in a marriage is to be, barefoot and pregnant and in the kitchen making dinner every night? No, of course not. Right. But does it mean that there are unique roles, especially when you start having children, with respect to the ways that a father and a mother can impact the family and make the family as successful as possible? Absolutely. Do I think, for instance, that women are more emotionally in tune to a situation than men a lot of the times on average? Yes, I think that's obvious. Does that mean that a woman is going to be more aware of vulnerabilities or dangerous things that could affect your children, especially when they're very, very young and infants? Absolutely. Is it beneficial for a woman to have that sort of connection with their children when it comes to nourishing them and caring for them and building that connection with them? Absolutely. Is it also important for the father to be able to foster that relationship young? Yes. Okay. So now we're going to run into some limitations. Right? Because why does the father have to protect and provide? Well, because if the woman is going to work at that same time, that means she's going to have to take her child and she's going to have to hand him off to somebody else to be able to nurture them, to educate them, and to be able to form those bonds with them at a very, very early age, right? They're off to daycare, right? So she can go back and, okay, so what's the trade-off? Well, the trade-off is the child is not going to pair or bond with the mother or the father as well as they would have if the mother was there for the child during those very, very formative years up front. All right. So that leads me to conclude that, gosh, maybe God designed this in such a way to where the mother plays an incredibly impactful role. And so the reason why the husband and the father must be dedicated and must be capable is because you need her to be able to provide and to be able to protect your children at those very, very early formative stages, which means she's not going to be able to go out and provide for herself. You're going to have to do it. And if you do it well, she's going to feel very, very secure in playing that role with your guys' children. And that's going to have incredible benefits for the kids and for the family and for you two together. Right? So I think these roles exist. And I think as you have children, they become even more apparent. Now, does that mean at a different time that a woman can still, pursue things outside of just being a mother and a wife? Of course. Right? And of course she can even do that during those times. But I think that when women embrace that role and when men embrace their roles, what you find is collaboration, not competition. And increasingly, I think women have increasingly been told by society that, no, your job is to compete with men because you can do anything a man can do. Well, no, you can't. And guess what? Men can't do everything women can do. I tell people this repeatedly. Early on in my marriage, I learned the hard way that when my wife said, I don't have a good feeling about this, I needed to listen regardless of whether or not she could fully articulate and explain what was wrong. Sometimes it was just the fact that emotionally she was far more in tune with what was going on in that environment than I was. I'm looking around, facts, evidence, the whole deal, and she is picking up on stuff that she might not have been able to fully articulate to my satisfaction, but she was right.
Yeah.
And so, again, I think what I would tell people is that if you want to believe what the culture and what the experts are telling you right now, fine, go ahead. But here's what I'm also going to tell you. When we look at feminism especially, and this gets people mad at me all the time, but like, don't shoot me, I'm just the messenger. We are living in the most feminist time in all of human history, which is to say that feminist doctrines with respect to ideas about traditional roles between men and women are at a low point, right? They've been almost completely supplanted in our culture with this idea that there is no fundamental difference, and this is all about just pursuing individual aims regardless of one's sex or the roles that might have been traditionally associated with them. We are living in the height of that ideology, the height of it. Right now, you could say all day long, maybe it hasn't gone as far as you would like, but you certainly can't say that it's worse now than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago, okay? And the very women who have embraced this model, which would be considered liberal women, young liberal women between the ages of 18 and 29 are experiencing the highest degree of mental illness in recorded human history. And liberal women specifically are at over 50%. So over 50% of liberal women polled are experiencing the highest degree of mental illness and unhealth or distress than at any point in recorded history. It's actually half for conservative women, which typically tend to fall into the role of, the traditional view of the role of a wife, a mother, et cetera.
Right.
So what that tells me is by your own standards, pursuing your own, ideology, you're not happy. And you can't tell me it's because society hasn't properly embraced it. What are you talking about? Every single culturally shaping institution, from education to media to arts and entertainment, politics, have reinforced the narrative that the feminists have offered us with respect to traditional gender roles.
Fulfillment, happiness, and satisfaction would increase as that exposure continues to increase.
And the women who have embraced that the most are the least happy. So I'm just saying, if you want to continue to go along with this narrative and suggest that it's men's fault or it's somebody else's fault or we just haven't properly embraced it yet, again, maybe you could make that argument 40 years ago. I don't think you can effectively make that argument today. And so what I would say is that as someone that is more of what you would, a traditionally masculine man, does that mean I have my wife buttoned up in the kitchen? I was telling you before we came on, my wife built this entire studio. Like the table I'm sitting, which is this massive wooden table. Why? Because traditional gender roles doesn't mean she can't do woodworking or she can't fix stuff. My wife is far more handy around the house than I am. She has a knack for it. She grew up with her stepfather teaching her how to fix stuff all the time, and she took to it, and she's phenomenal at it. And my job as her husband is not to say, that's not your role. My job is to say, that's awesome. This is an incredible way that you contribute to the family, and I want to reinforce that, and I want to heap praise on you for it. But that doesn't take away my responsibility. My fundamental responsibility is to protect and provide. And so I think it's important to understand that when we say traditional gender roles, it's because we understand that there are things that are intrinsic or inherent within male and female roles. And that doesn't mean that women can't also pursue other things that are not traditionally associated with that. But when we embrace both our roles and our God-given talents, and we respect that within a marital environment, then again, we're constantly cooperating with one another to get the best possible result, not competing with one another based off of what the culture has told us we should want.
Yeah. Well, the concept of your studio is something that resonates with me. I once heard that, and I'm paraphrasing here, that a man's job is to provide the resources, right? The raw resources. And then a woman's job is to take those raw resources and beautify them or turn them into something productive and useful. So you think about your studio, for example, in our case, in modern times, it's I go out, provide the income, we buy the materials, and then you take it and you beautify it. You make it into something useful, or turning a house into a home, or at the very base level, I provide you my seed, and you take that and cultivate this human being inside of your womb for 9 months. That's nothing I can do. I'm going to provide the raw resources, but you as a woman can beautify that and make it better. I think this speaks right into what you're talking about, this collaboration versus competition.
Yeah, one, and if people are looking for an academic study to prove what I'm saying is true, you're probably not going to find it. But I will point to, I don't know, thousands of years of human history and point out that while it's not always manifested perfectly, I think that's important to understand. A lot of times when they look at traditional roles, they will essentially say that because it was not perfectly executed, therefore it's bad. Well, yeah, if you're going to hold up any standard to utopia or perfection, then every standard is going to fall short. But the question is which one has actually done, which one, no kidding, has actually done the best job at providing stability and happiness and love and growth. And I think it's the traditional family. I don't think there's any question that that's the case. Again, what I think is important is that when a man and a woman come together in marriage and they respect their roles, it also allows for more freedom to be able to find your respective places within the marriage. Because one of the things that's so important, I think, in relationships between men and women is, it's not just I love you and I'm passionate about you. You are, when we say building a marriage, it's what we mean, right? There's going to be challenges, there's going to be struggles. And here's two people that have committed to stick with one another, and finding out as you go through those struggles and those challenges, where your talents and your tools are best used and where they're not, and then respecting where somebody else covers down where you couldn't do it as well, and you do the same for them. That actually strengthens the bond between you two, because there's a transaction taking place there that's not a transaction in the sense of an economic transaction, but it's a transaction in the sense where both of you are getting value from the relationship, not just because of what you consume, but because of what you contribute. And that's really important.
I had an experience with my ex-wife, and it vividly underscores what you're talking about. There was somebody I was considering going into business with, and she had met this individual, and she said, "Don't do business with that person. Don't get into business with that person." And I said, "Why?" She couldn't explain it. Logically, made sense to me, but she couldn't articulate why I shouldn't get into business with that person. So naturally, I went ahead and did it anyways. I lost tens of thousands of dollars doing it. And she never rubbed it in my face, to her credit.
Yeah.
But there was a moment of reckoning, which is, hey, maybe you ought to take into consideration some of the things that I can see that you can't. And that was a very vivid reminder of her contribution, among others, to the relationship.
Yeah, no, it's I had a moment when I was in the military, and it had to do with somebody I was serving with, and she just had a bad feeling about him, and it's like, this is just not a good guy. And then later on, that became revealed, and thankfully, it wasn't in a situation where like my life depended on it. But I remember that. I remember two things from that moment. One was how right she was and how wrong I was, and how arrogant I was about it at the time. And I don't like being wrong. and I remember having to go to her like, "Babe, you were right, and I was wrong." And now what's interesting is that I don't see it. At that time, I saw it as frustrating. Like, I've got to do something. I got to make decisions. This logically matches up, and you're asking me to defy logic because you got a feeling. And now, and that was frustrating to me. It's not frustrating to me anymore. I look at it as a huge advantage that I take into any situation. Whereas if Tina tells me, "Babe, something's off," I'm like, cool. Like, I'm not going to waste time.
Done.
I'm not going to, cool.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's powerful. Well, Nick, this conversation has taken a completely different turn. I had notes on things I wanted to talk with you about, and we didn't hit any of them really, because I really wanted to dive down this. No, it's good. I'm grateful we talked about this because it's something that frankly, we don't talk a whole lot about on the podcast. And I think it's good for both men and women to hear some of this messaging and some of what you shared today. And maybe at some point we can do a round 2 and talk about some other topics and issues, because the information that you share resonates with me. I know it resonates with a lot of the guys listening. Before we wind things up today, if you would just let the men know where to connect with you, where to reach out, where to learn more about the work you're doing. I got to say, I love connecting with you and following you on Instagram because you bring up really good points in a comedic, interesting, fun way that maybe isn't so threatening to people who are just hearing these concepts for the first time. But I do appreciate that. So let the guys know where to connect is what I'm saying.
No, I really appreciate it. I would love to come on again. We'll have to have you on our show as well. So we have a show called Making the Argument. Yeah, we have a show called Making the Argument on YouTube. We tried to make it simple. So Nick J. Freitas, if you're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Nick J. Freitas will always get you to where I'm at. But yeah, we talk a lot about some of the issues that we've talked about today on there, and I appreciate that. We do try to add. I know I wasn't very comedic today. We do try to add kind of some levity to some of these discussions because they are difficult. They can be trying. But again, I never want to come off as the angry guy. I can certainly be passionate about what I believe, but honestly, I think. When it comes to talking about masculinity, when it comes to talking about being a husband or a father, these are things that bring me just an incredible amount of joy. And so I always want to make sure that's reflected when I'm talking about it.
Well, you do a phenomenal job, and I appreciate you. I know the guys will love this podcast and this conversation. We'll make round 2 happen, and I would love to accept that invitation to be on your podcast at some point. We'll sync everything up. Nick, appreciate you, brother. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Ryan.